Welcome to Powering the Future Within, the podcast where we explore the breakthroughs shaping the future of MedTech. I'm Omari Bouknight, CEO of Resonant Link Medical. Each episode, we speak with founders, engineers, clinicians, and visionaries who are driving the next wave of medical innovation, advancing technologies that are smarter, less invasive, and more connected than ever before. This is where the future of health takes shape. Let's dive in. Today, I'm joined by Karun Naga, a MedTech innovator and operator whose career spans engineering, law, intellectual property, and company creation. Karun has spent formative years at the Foundry, helped shape the early development of Ardian, and helped lead its course to the eventual acquisition by Medtronic. Karun is now the founder and CEO of Apreo Health, a company tackling major unmet needs in lung disease. He brings a rare, multidisciplinary perspective to our industry, and I'm thrilled to have him on the show. Welcome, Karun.
Thanks, Omari. Really great to be here.
So your background is perfect for MedTech, spanning engineering, law, intellectual property, and business. I'd love to start with your journey. At what point did it become clear that MedTech was the field you wanted to build your career in?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. I started in engineering and, grew up in the Midwest, surrounded by the auto industry. And really that colored my view on what engineering was. And the kind of rust belt that we had in the Midwest, a lot of production engineering, didn't really get me excited. It was something I had a lot of exposure to, and I actually thought that I wasn't much of an engineer because didn't really cultivate any passion, excitement, and that's really where I pivoted and said, you know what, I'm going to try something different. I'm willing to expose myself to an entirely different educational discipline, not necessarily with the intent of becoming a lawyer, but with pushing myself in different domains, trying to develop weaknesses into strengths. And that's when I discovered intellectual property. And that brought me out to the West Coast. Like 25 years ago, came to the West Coast. It was the new economy. We had the dot-com bubble that had formed. And as an intellectual property attorney, I had exposure to many different domains, industries, and that's where I saw the medical device industry really for the first time. I saw truly innovative concepts, coming from the minds of very intellectually curious physician inventors and entrepreneurs about how we can alleviate suffering, save lives, and that really resonated with me and said, hey, this is not just something I want to support.
Right.
This is something that I want to do full time.
Yeah, that's great. And so one of the places where your disciplines really intersect is IP, or intellectual property. A lot of times we hear people say that in MedTech, IP is table stakes. Everyone needs it, but no one really values it. What is your take, given all of your experience on IP and the role that it actually plays in MedTech?
Yeah, admittedly I'm biased, but I would really challenge, what you just said. I actually feel that in the medical device industry, IP plays as strong or greater role as in any industry. And here's why. You have concepts that are being developed that in many cases are pretty provocative. They're challenging the practice of medicine. We're doing something very different than what's been done before. It has life and death consequences. It requires a tremendous amount of investment to take the steps through technical risk, clinical risk, regulatory risk, get it to market, demonstrate that the dogs are going to eat the dog food. And even when you are successful in commercially deploying it, the resources required in terms of a specialized sales force
Right.
are incredibly high. So when you look at the amount of investment being made in new products, um, if somebody else can, after all the investment that you made, and regularly $100 million to get something to market, $200 million to successfully commercially deploy it, if somebody else could just accelerate their development and offer a fast follower technology behind all the work that you've done, um, no one would invest in medical devices if that were the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
Best way to describe it, Omari, is I look at like MedTech, pioneering MedTech innovation as you're stepping into a room that's completely pitch black. You have no idea if the next step you take is going to be on solid ground or if you're going to be stepping off a cliff. It's that treacherous because there's still a lot that we don't know about the body and the disease, and these have true uh, um, life or death consequences. And so you have to be very careful in every step that you take. And when you take those steps, you want to drop a stake in the ground. That's your intellectual property. Every time you learn something and you discover that you're on a rewarding path, you want to claim that path as your own. The challenge in medtech, though, is we have to publish or perish. We have to contribute to thought leadership to make sure that the rest of the world understands the journey that we're taking. That's the only way that we can get clinical adoption of these new pioneering approaches. Well, a publication is like a road sign. It's educating everybody on that treacherous journey. It's almost like you're in that black, pitch dark room, and your publication is like a light that shines directly behind you. It illuminates the path that you've taken, but your path forward is still dark, right? So if you are still taking very deliberate, careful steps at a slow pace, while everybody else is able to accelerate their path using the light that you're shining, that's fundamentally unfair unless you get credit for the work you've done. And that's what intellectual property is. So I feel like IP in this space is particularly important. And if you go back 30 years to the stent wars, or go back 15, 20 years to the heart wars with TAVR or TAVI, these are such great examples of the role that intellectual property has played in giving the leaders, the pioneers, credit for taking those risks.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a couple of themes there that I think are really important. So, one, you sort of mentioned the value of establishing leadership, right? Because you're establishing a new space, you're pioneering, you want to publish, you want to establish your leadership, but at the same time, you don't want to put down all of these road signs and pickets that allow it someone easily to follow you. So that balance between leadership and then also sort of making sure that you enjoy the investments that you've poured into the field. So that seems like it's quite the balance.
It really is, and what I like to achieve strategically here is if we identify the key features in a new therapy or a new device that is attributable for superior commercial performance. And so when we talk about performance, we talk about safety, efficacy, durability of effect, the ability to treat the wide segment of the patient population. So if you've developed and identified features that really contribute to that advantage, well, you should get credit for it. And if someone wants to follow your path, well, and they want to use the same features that you've built value in, well, they have to give you credit for it. If they want to take a different path and use different features, let them take that journey. And that may be a longer journey. It may be a journey that is actually better. I mean, you see these second generation, third generation devices that end up frog leaping the first generation devices. And sometimes those second or third generation devices have intellectual property that protects them. I mean, that's what's happened. If you look at the stent wars, obviously J&J Cordis had initial leadership because they licensed the balloon expandable stent from Dr. Palmaz, and that gave them leadership, but they were unable to maintain leadership because you had companies like Guidant and Boston Scientific that developed their own innovations that led to superior second and third generation devices. And then those innovations in the second, third generation devices had their own intellectual property. So in medical devices, unlike pharma, where pharma, you get a composition patent that covers your formulation. Um, it's really hard to innovate beyond that. That formulation gets your 20 years of patent protection and market exclusivity. But in devices, those second and third generation innovations can not only uh, uh, empower a competitor, but it also extends patent terms. So you can have devices, product categories in the medical device space that enjoy patent protection for 30 or 40 years because of the serial innovation that exists.
Yeah. And when I hear you discuss the multiple approaches, would you argue then that IP can be just as important for someone who's coming second or third to market as someone who's doing market development, developing something from scratch? Or do you think IP takes on a more important role for one versus the other?
It's case by case depending on how pioneering you are, right? If like in the case of Ardian, I mean, we coined a therapy called renal denervation. That wasn't just new technology, that was new medicine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we developed very broad concept level IP that dominated the space. And so you could say that the IP was immensely important and valuable in that context. But I would say, for a fast follower, um, not only them developing IP was important, but them understanding the scope and the strength of the Ardian IP was also important. So we talk about, developing IP that protects your own technology, but that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is what we call freedom to operate. Making sure that you understand where other people's IP sits and what might be your exposure to infringement of that IP. And so I think you got to be able to understand both domains really well to have success in this industry.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to Artie in a little bit, but let's shift to the Foundry because joining that team really seems to have been an inflection point in your medtech journey. So, for people who have heard of it, maybe, but don't fully understand the model, how would you describe what the Foundry is? It's not quite an incubator. It's not exactly an investment vehicle either. So, what would you describe? How would you describe the Foundry?
The term I would use, it's one that I've heard more recently, is venture studio.
Right.
And so, we're a group of serial entrepreneurs that share similar values, uh, like working together. We have a very similar mission or ethos around doing something that's never been done before to dramatically improve the standard of care. And so I've been involved with the Foundry for 19 years now. The Foundry's been around for over 25 years. In that time, I think we started north of 30 companies, each company having a unique goal of um, developing, in most cases, the device. Sometimes we've done drug development or drug delivery, but in most cases, it's been developing a therapeutic device to, again, alleviate suffering, save lives in many different therapeutic domains. I'd say that's one of the things that's probably made us unique as serial entrepreneurs, Omari, is usually a serial entrepreneur will stay within a technology domain or a therapeutic field because they're very comfortable in the sandbox they're in. They're recycling talent, recycling know-how. But we've very deliberately gone into other domains. We like to cross-pollinate. We like to learn. And so if we were to map our technologies across the body, we've had application from head to toe, many different systems, disease processes, uh, um, anatomies, physiologies, technologies. We've done work in, passive mechanical implants. We've done electrical based elevation systems. We've done drug delivery and chemistry. So we really go wherever we see a compelling unmet need and try to develop some type of working knowledge or expertise to crack the code on that problem.
And it seems it's so fascinating that you go across so many different indications and applications. What's generally the inspiration? Is it just from the external world, internal world? What's generally the inspiration for some of these breakthrough concepts?
It's really just aligning around big unmet needs, finding clinical problems that are compelling to us, and then developing a very intimate understanding of those problems. So a lot of people look at our technologies and they're like, wow, okay, these are really amazing breakthrough concepts. What's the common thread? And I think for us, the common thread is really developing a very deep appreciation for the problem. And so it really starts with knowing what questions to ask. I would say that's a common thread across every company, because if you look at some of the stuff that we've done, dermatology, obesity, structural heart, neurovascular, respiratory, I mean, there's no common thread in terms of the technologies or the disease processes that we've served. It's really, in each case, going to many of the different clinical, regulatory, payer stakeholders and developing a very intimate understanding of what is the problem that needs to be addressed here.
Right. So the thread is really the unmet need and deriving some kind of passion around it. And then if you can have a key insight that addresses it, then that's really something that the Foundry is probably quite interested in.
Yeah, and I think it's embracing the notion that the practice of medicine is imperfect, even flawed at times, built on incorrect assumptions. And so being willing to go in and ask tough, provocative questions about, why are we doing this today? Is this really the right solution?
Right. And so you joined 19 years ago. And at that time, were you joining specifically with Ardian in mind, or was the path more open-ended than that?
A little bit of both. Ardian had already been incubated. It was just moving out of the foundry. And so it was a very small team, fewer than 10 employees, uh, preclinical. So we were just developing animal models. And so my role was a bit hybrid. It was supporting Ardian in a fractional capacity, while also being resident at the foundry to help them incubate the next venture, which ultimately ended up becoming Miramar Labs, and also supporting the foundry in a variety of other pursuits, largely intellectual property based. You can imagine we have a collection of super creative people. We've generated a very dense store of intellectual property. And so someone like myself who has a great passion for the topic could kind of help build that asset base.
Right. Yeah. And it's hard to capture everything that you lived through with Ardian before and after the Medtronic acquisition, but it's such an important journey. How do you look back at that story? How did pursuing a completely new market like renal denervation, targeting hypertension, shape your thinking? And what were a couple of lessons that have stayed with you?
Yeah, wow, what a loaded question.
all
And
all in 10 minutes.
yeah, that company was started about 20 years ago. And, we just got reimbursement, in the last year.
Right.
And 2 years ago got PMA approval. So there's no such thing as an overnight success. So that's one of the lessons here is the more pioneering, the more provocative. Again, that journey speaks to really resetting the standard of care for patients with uh, uncontrolled high blood pressure or hypertension. Developing a device-based intervention when to date the only credible treatments were pharmaceutical-based. So these things are a marathon; they're not a sprint. Even though there are many days where we were sprinting to get to the next milestone. So it's really striking a right balance between that grit and intensity of just very methodical um, execution with a high degree of risk tolerance, while at the same time thinking about the long term, the big picture. So I'd say striking that balance is really important because there are things in a startup that you simply can't do in a big company. Making decisions with high risk tolerance. You're never going to have all the data that you need that's going to definitively tell you which path to go. You're going to have to make tough calls, technical, clinical, regulatory, because you're not going to have all the information you need. And so being able to make those decisions and adjust as you go is say, okay, we made the decision. Now, in 6 months later, we realized well, you know what, that was probably not the best decision. How do we course correct, right? So being very nimble and being able to do that is a difficult thing, and it requires a very special team, a team that's comfortable with risk. I would say being comfortable being uncomfortable, but can cultivate enough trust, because when you're in periods or times of great uncertainty, not being overly stressed by that uncertainty, because when that happens, if you don't have the right culture and trust,
Yeah.
you end up taking it out on each other.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it seems to me that you would have to have a really strong cultural alignment around the fact that you're trying to do something pioneering, and doing something pioneering is difficult, and it's going to take a long time and going to have some setbacks along the way. So that feels like that needs to be culturally knitted into the formation of the company.
Yeah, a lot of credit to Andrew Cleland for not just his role as CEO, but I'd say as a mentor, as I think an incredibly important, um, I'd say luminary in um, our ecosystem around leadership, about developing people. There are many lessons I learned from him about how to build teams and how to make sure that we're all here for the same reason, and that's the mission: making sure that we're doing something that is very impactful on lives, and making sure that that's the North Star for the organization. I once, with one of my previous companies, we wrote a mission statement together, and someone at the end of the session, was really excited and inspired by the mission statement that we wrote, and said, with a mission statement like this, who needs alarm clock? And
I
I think that
love
was
that.
really well said. I
I
mean,
love that. Yeah.
me and my team here at the Foundry and at Apreo, we have no problem getting out of bed in the morning, getting into work. It's really exciting, because when you have a hand at um, really dramatically improving people's lives, that's pretty invigorating. That and I think that's critical to the success of a startup.
Yeah. Yeah. With a mission statement like this, who needs alarm clocks? That's a great one. But it strikes me that you learned so much through that journey, and obviously Foundry continues to focus on pioneering technologies. Is there anything that came out of the RDN experience, wasn't an overnight success, took all the time, the grit? Is there anything coming out of that that you now look at when you evaluate new opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great one. Ardian, um, I think at the time we started it, was viewed as a science project. We are looking at the entire system in the body. When we think about hypertension, how is it affected? Many people think it's a mechanical system in terms of the amount of fluid in your body, and the filters and the kidneys that are applying to that, that are uh, applying to the fluid levels, and that's what's controlling blood pressure. Some people think it's hormonal. Some people think it's nerve based. And that was a very, very intense research project that really forced us to align many different types of stakeholders, even within medicine. You have cardiologists, you have neurologists, you have, uh, um, kidney specialists. Um, and how do you get everybody aligned here at a clinical level? And then once you go beyond clinical, you have your regulatory stakeholders. For anyone that knows the story, knows that after being acquired by Medtronic, we ran our US pivotal study and failed that
Yeah.
study.
Yeah.
And that called into question the fundamentals of the therapy.
Right.
And so it goes back to what we were saying earlier about there's no such thing as an overnight success. I think with something that provocative, um, it made it even harder. Once you get some clinical evidence that may force you to question the underlying thesis, that added 8 years to the journey.
Yeah,
And
because
so,
the basis wasn't anything that had already been established before. So to your point, with it being more provocative, it was easy to question the mechanism, right?
yes, 100%. And so the lesson learned from that is, I think we need to be really thoughtful about how much risk we're willing to take on in these projects, because when you encounter that kind of risk, it adds more time, it adds more capital required. And from a founder perspective, it's incredibly dilutive.
Right.
And so I think we've been more deliberate since then about looking at projects where there's been a little bit more pavement laid in front of us, where there's more alignment amongst key stakeholders, so that we know if we're able to run a clinical study with a binary output, does it work or does it not work? There's going to be violent agreement across all stakeholders that this is going to be the new standard of care.
Right. Yeah. And I think that'll be a good lead in here in just a minute. That's a really good point. It strikes me that these trials, when you're doing something that is so novel, so new, and as you say, somewhat provocative, that the trial requirements and burden are very, very high. And, I think what we're seeing is that these my sham controlled trials are very, very difficult to get through. And so the fact that RDN has come this far and been able to establish that with such a strong unmet need, you could argue that uncontrolled blood pressure, hypertension is the number one challenge in cardiology. It's just amazing how far it's come and the potential impact it'll still yet to have.
Well, and just on that point, Omari, I think a lot of people look at the Foundry, look at the technologies and the diseases that we're able to treat or in some cases defeat, and they're in awe. And I think the one thing that many overlook is the amount of thought and creativity that goes into clinical trial design. In my view, it's pretty unheralded because you have to at times be very thoughtful and creative about how you design a study when you think about endpoints, when you think about some endpoints being noisier, dealing with the placebo effect, the Hawthorne effect, the practice of medicine today, and what's ethically possible or advisable. It's incredibly complicated, and it requires a tremendous amount of interdisciplinary and cross-functional engagement. You need clinical regulatory folks, reimbursement folks, you need statisticians to be involved. And that's one that's not, I think, given as much attention as it deserves.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a fantastic point. And it strikes me as interesting. You go through this journey with Artie and obviously overcome a lot of challenges along the way. It was not an overnight success. But having come through all of that, you could have very easily moved fully into venture capital, formally into venture capital. But instead, you decided to go back to operating again. Take us inside that decision. What did that decision look like for you?
Yeah, it's something I challenge myself. Over the years, I've picked up a lot of experiences, a variety of experiences in different therapeutic domains, different technologies, working at companies at different stages. Post Ardian, I stayed on at Medtronic for 2 years. Was actually in their corporate development group for that time, and so played a role in strategy and investing. I made a number of investments on behalf of Medtronic at that time. Actually, a notable one going back almost 15 years ago now was HeartFlow.
Okay. Yeah.
And for a while, that was a dubious thing because that company had taken on so much capital. It was on an uncertain journey. Obviously, it's been one of the biggest, most successful IPOs in MedTech this year. So I'm very proud, that I could say I was involved in some of the very early phases there. So definitely have had interest in investing. With the Foundry, we work very closely with many different types of venture capital funds because our model of high risk, high reward aligns well with the venture model. But back to your question, let me offer you a quote, actually, one that I hold really dear that hopefully will illustrate what I care most about. This is a quote from Gandhi: "A small body of determined spirits, fired by an unquenchable faith in their mission, can alter the course of history." That's what we do. That's what we do at the Foundry. That's what we do at our portfolio companies. That's what we're doing day by day at Apreo Health. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. And
Without
It
the alarm clock.
requires
Without the alarm clock.
without the alarm clock. I don't need, yeah. But it requires tremendous focus and sacrifice, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and sometimes it's hard to justify that because it really demands a lot of yourself, uh, your loved ones as well. But for me, that's where I feel I can have greatest impact. For me, it's impact in people, and so having impact in terms of uh, combating disease and finding patients, their families, doctors who have really struggled to treat their patients and giving them options that they didn't have before is incredibly rewarding. Gives me chills thinking about that. And then to partner with similarly passionate people to do something really good and noble is a real privilege. It's a dream come true. And I think there's a time and place to do venture capital if that's in the cards. But right now, there's no place I'd rather be than fighting the good fight.
Yeah, that's amazing. And for the listeners who may not know much about Apreo, tell us a little bit about that. You're targeting lung conditions now, including COPD. What's the core insight and the unmet need there that pulled you into this space?
Sure. This is one I'm very excited about. I've had a lot of really great, again, privileged to be part of a lot of great journeys and rides, but this is one I'm pretty passionate about. When we talk about COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, it's really an umbrella term for any condition that leads to difficulty in breathing. And I think since COVID, we as a world have developed a better appreciation for the importance of the lungs. In our ecosystem, as you know, Omari, there's been so much investment in the heart. And yeah, I mean, if your heart stops working, you cannot pump oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, and the body can't survive. That's entirely valid. But where does that oxygenated blood come from? It starts in the lungs. So if the lungs are not functioning, then you can't even get the oxygen rich blood to the heart before it gets to the rest of the body. And so I think the last several years we've developed a great appreciation for it. But it's not that there hasn't been great investment in COPD. For the last 30, 40 years, there's been hundreds of millions of dollars invested in innovation, just a profound track record of failure. A lot of things haven't worked. Now, at Apreo, we're focused on treating severe emphysema. Severe emphysema is a subset of COPD where the lungs have filled with air, and that air is trapped in those lungs. The best way to appreciate this is if you were to take a deep breath in right now, and before exhaling, take a second breath right after that first breath. That second breath is the only breath that patients with emphysema have. That's called dyspnea, or shortness of breath. It's incredibly uncomfortable. If you're sitting in a chair, you're probably fine managing and surviving on that shortness of breath. But if you have to walk across the room, walk up the stairs, play with your grandkids, the most fundamental of basic activities are not possible. It deprives these patients of quality of life and dignity of life. There are some doctors that call this disease death by armchair, not because the armchair kills them, but because they have such little breath that all they can do is sit in their chair until they die.
Yeah.
It's a very lonely disease.
And sometimes you even hear the difficulties of sleeping at night, requiring multiple pillows, not being able to get the right position. So impacting life 24/7.
Yeah, it's a horrible way to go. And you'll have people as young as in their early 50s stricken with this disease. Um, Usually what happens is I'd say the disease essentially adds 20 years to your lungs. And so if you're in your 50s or 60s, your lungs are functioning at kind of an end of life stage. So of course, what are we doing at Apreo? Well, this goes back to the notion that the practice of medicine here is flawed. And if you go back 30, 40 years, um, what we were doing as a society and as a clinical ecosystem was you had patients whose lungs were hyperinflated. The most diseased parts of the lung was filling with air, and that air wasn't getting out. So that's why your lungs are so full that you can't take in a deep breath. And it's called air trapping. Air trapping that causes hyperinflation. So many, many of these patients, they were so hyperinflated that their lungs are like 2 to 3 times their normal size. And so what we were doing in our healthcare ecosystem was these patients were so desperate to breathe better is that you would actually go in surgically and excise big pieces of lung tissue. You would perform what we call a lung volume reduction surgery to take out portions of the hyperinflated lung so that there was more room in the chest cavity so that some of the remaining healthy tissue could then take in more air and function better. And that worked for a lot of these patients. It worked actually well, but you're subjecting a patient who has very compromised health to a highly invasive surgery. Is surgically attacking the lung the answer for an organ that has highly compromised function? That was one of the first questions we asked ourselves as we were incubating Apreo. As we started to look at the lineage of serial innovation that followed lung volume reduction surgery, we looked at many attempts called BLVR, bronchoscopic lung volume reduction. So these were attempts to treat the diseased lung less invasively than surgery because it was bronchoscopic. However, it was equally destructive. So my partners at the Foundry actually invented endobronchial valves. We founded over 20 years ago Emphasis Medical that developed the Zephyr valve that's now sold by Pulmonx. And so this valve allows air to leave the lung and doesn't allow air to go in. So essentially what happens in many of these patients, they'll get 4 to 6 valves in airways that communicate with a very diseased hyperinflated part of the lung. And they're not treating, those valves are not treating that part of the lung. They're collapsing that part of the lung. They're sacrificing that part of the lung to allow the rest of the lung to expand and function better.
So it's not
So like I said,
resection, it's not the surgical resection, but it still keeps that portion of lung in place. It just basically neutralizes it.
100%, exactly. It neutralizes it. But in those parts of the lung, you will have about 30 to 50% tissue destruction, which also means that you're going to have 50 to 70% of your native lung healthy, intact. So when you're defunctionalizing and neutralizing, as you say, that part of the lung, where you're actually sacrificing 50 to 70% healthy tissue. And that's why I say, like, attacking and sacrificing a part of an organ that really needs your help is not the answer. So that's really what opened our eyes up to the approach with Apreo and say, how can we work with the lung, not against the lung? Let's not attack the lung. Let's work collaboratively with the lung. And so the goal was not to attack the lung or take out tissue or defunctionalize tissue. The goal was to eliminate the air trapping. So we often say simple is better. And in this case, I think that really amplifies that message, because what we're doing is identifying the areas of the lung that are the most hyperinflated, and we create a pathway to allow that trapped air to escape. We identify airways that have collapsed, especially when you exhale, and that's what's happening. The air is trapped because when you exhale, you're trying to push the air out. It can't get out because the airways that have fed those hyperinflated parts of the lung have collapsed. We put in a minimal implant in those parts of the lung so that they don't collapse during exhalation. And so now you can empty the lung. And when you're emptying the lung, that means your next breath can be much deeper.
Right. Yeah. Progressive. That's fantastic. Fantastic. And so in terms of where the company sits right now, you just raised a very significant Series B, and it's caught a lot of attention. What were the dynamics that drove such a large funding raise as part of a Series B round?
Yeah. Thanks, Omari. So to summarize, I mean, we closed in August of this year. Our Series B financing was a round of $130 million, 130, which, as you noted, it's a substantial sum for especially a Series B clinical stage company. We intended not to raise that much at the beginning. We didn't want to take that much dilution. We mapped out our path to completion of a U.S. pivotal study, and then the subsequent path to PMA approval with favorable pivotal data. And we still didn't need $130 million. But when we went to the market, we found that you had a lot of investors who like to fund commercial stage companies because that provided a very reliable path to an exit, to a liquidity event like acquisition or IPO. But for a clinical stage company, even with great pivotal data, it was still a bit unclear what the path to liquidity would be. A little less unclear in cardiology because you had a fairly large ecosystem or market of acquirers. But when you're outside of cardiology, it's a little less dense. You have less medical device companies that are willing to buy clinical stage assets. So that was kind of that's a summary of what the market was when we went into the fundraising process. And so what we found is we had investors that really liked our early clinical data, had conviction that the study that we would run, our pivotal study, if we ran it well, we executed well, that it would produce great, highly favorable clinical evidence that would compel FDA to approve our PMA. But they wanted to make sure that there was enough capital committed from the investor syndicate to fund the early commercialization to make sure that we could get great adoption and revenue ramp so that we weren't dependent on a multinational medical device company acquiring us. We had as an alternative, or maybe even the preferred path, of taking this to market ourselves and potentially going to the public markets through an IPO. So those are the circumstances that led us to building an extraordinarily large syndicate and arriving at that $130 million financing number.
So essentially, you're in control of your own destiny all the way through.
Yes.
So it's interesting because you hear a lot right now in medtech in particular that a lot of the VCs are looking to go later stage. They want to invest in a Series D, as you mentioned, sort of the raise that will support the commercialization or maybe the end of a pivotal trial when it's fairly clear that things are looking good and that PMA approval is a high likelihood. And now we see an example of going very early with a very large round. Do you think this is a unique circumstance for Apreo, or do you think this is something that potentially could become more of a trend for early stage?
I really hope it's the latter, Omari. I have to tell you, we had probably 40 funds that went under NDA, went into our data room. That's a lot of diligence. And the majority of those funds said, we love the data, love what you guys are doing, love the team, love the philosophy, but we really would rather fund the commercial round. So call us when you're ready to raise that round. And, my counter to that was, we're building a pretty strong syndicate here. It's possible that we may never be back in the market to raise that commercial round. Yeah. And they're like, yeah, but I'm going to pass anyways. That was the most common story. And that's why it took us the better part of a year to do this, is because there were so many funds that reacted that way. And I'm really delighted to say that the scenario that I cautioned them on has come to fruition. With the syndicate of investors that we have, led by Bain Capital and Norwest, we have tremendous reserve power in this company. And I'll never say never, but we have the ability to control our own destiny with the 130 million committed. And if we need to go back and drive to even greater revenue ramp and adoption, I think with these funds, we have the ability to do that. So I'm really proud of the accomplishment. The team at Apreo and the early investors who, stayed with this and their resolve to take this to the next level. And I only hope that some of those investors that passed take note from this experience and we'll look at other clinical stage investments with a higher degree of seriousness.
Well, certainly everyone's keeping a close eye on Apreo and its progress, and so I think that the results and having a positive outcome here will definitely inform some concepts in terms of maybe moving a little earlier stage, and that certainly would be beneficial for all of us operating within in medtech.
Well, that has to be the case because you're not going to have commercial stage assets without clinical stage investing in clinical stage assets, and I I think the venture capital community certainly understands that,
Yeah.
but I don't see behavior necessarily aligning with that understanding. And that's not to blame any one person or fund. I think everyone's trying to figure out how they're going to make money, and there's still a lot of risk in those clinical stages of the company. And so I would really like to see more of the multinationals step up and acquire to reward investors who come in earlier and make sure that they get the credit for investing early. We get a nice bump in valuation. We get a liquidity event that pays them 8 to 10x, so that there is reward that's commensurate with the risk that they're taking coming in at that early stage.
Well, there's so much going on in the ecosystem right now. I'm convinced that we're going to see a lot more interest and excitement. It will require a few more successes, but we're definitely trending in that direction, which is really exciting. So this has been a tremendous, tremendous conversation. Really enjoyed it. As we look to wrap up, I always like to ask, what's one or two pieces of advice that you would give to emerging medtech innovators who are trying to build meaningful companies today?
Yeah, great question, Omari. I go back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of people in our space. I mean, we're in businesses that are trying to improve people's lives. It requires a village to be successful. Um, that time and time again has rung true. And what I've seen from many early innovators, whether it was working as a patent attorney and writing patents with a physician founder, or making an investment in an early stage company, working closely with venture capital funds or while at Medtronic, I see incredibly passionate, gritty, entrepreneurs who think that it's them against the world. And in some cases it is, no question. If you're a provocative thinker and you're trying to get the world to revisit how we look at a particular disease, you might be on an island. But I think the key, and what I've had great success and personal reward and satisfaction from, is building partnerships, finding allies, because you can't do it alone. You need support. It's a highly cross-functional, interdisciplinary process here, and so you have to bring in those skill sets. And so, we are all very careful and concerned about preserving our equity position in these companies. We don't like slicing the pie or the bologna too thin. But I think what I've learned over the years, and this is really consistent with the Foundry's ethos, is collaborate over compete. Our enemy here is the disease that we're fighting, not each other. And sometimes we're much better off partnering and sharing our learnings based on a kind of a mutual or common goal than trying to fight each other and succeed at someone else's expense.
Yeah.
It's not a zero-sum game.
Right.
If we're successful working together, the tide rises and the pie widens for all of us to be enriched. And I think a lot of early stage folks don't embrace that the same way that I have. And it may take experience. That may be the only way to really appreciate it. But that's I'd say those are the nuggets of wisdom that I picked up over the years.
And especially poignant, that collaboration over competition when it's coming with someone so steeped in IP law. So it definitely there must be something to it. But
Well, and on that, I'm not saying dedicate your IP to the public.
right, exactly. Yeah.
If you look at the TAVR wars, the heart wars, finally Edwards and Medtronic settled out their differences, and they're working to get together to develop an immense market. But when they settled it out, Medtronic had to pay Edwards $1 billion. So Edwards did get credit for their leadership position.
Yeah. So collaboration over competition, but still be smart.
Yes, 100%.
Well, this has been an incredible discussion. Really enjoyed having you on and providing perspective to our audience. Thank you.
Hey, I really, really enjoyed the conversation, Omari. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to all of you for joining us today on Powering the Future Within. If this conversation inspired you, follow the show and share it with your MedTech community. I'm Omari Bouknight. Stay inspired and keep innovating.